At the end of the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, one of the 600,000 killed during the nation's bloodiest conflict. The country was divided, and the world regarded American democracy as a failed experiment. But what most did not realize was that a new era had dawned. The nation was entering an age of advancement. And from the void left by the death of perhaps its greatest statesman, a new breed of leader would emerge.
The Rockefellers, the Fords, the Carnegies were the first generation of what we know is now the entrepreneurial rock stars, or what are today are the Buffetts and the Jobs and the Gates. And so they were the ones that set the standard for the American dream. They owned a new frontier, literally and figuratively, of who we are as a culture.
Men of insight, innovation, and ingenuity, the likes of which the world had seldom seen. Over the next 5 decades, this small group would make history, propelling the United States of America to greatness.
These were great men with a vision that nobody else had. And that's why in the last century, that 50-year period, we built the world.
For the first time in America's short existence, the man most capable of leading the nation was not a politician. He was a self-made man who, through sheer force of will, had turned a poor upbringing on the docks of New York Harbor into an empire. At 16, Cornelius Vanderbilt bought a small ferryboat with a $100 loan. He soon earned a reputation as a cutthroat businessman, willing to use any means necessary to get ahead.
Back then, it was just pure competition. My brain against your brain, my effort against your effort. You just competed. That's the way they looked at business. It was the wild, wild west, and by hook or crook, it was just win or lose, and the best win.
He was a tough guy, getting into scraps with other men, beating the hell out of them and knocking them unconscious. That competitive streak and that toughness very much defined his character.
His single ferry soon became a fleet of boats, transporting goods and passengers to every corner of the growing country. Vanderbilt would eventually become so synonymous with shipping that he was known as the Commodore.
I think Vanderbilt recognized that what was going to be important is transporting goods from one place to another. And he had this idea that required infrastructure, and not infrastructure the government was going to provide, but that he was going to provide.
Over the next 40 years, Vanderbilt created the largest shipping empire in the world. Then, at the peak of his power, just before the Civil War, he did the unthinkable. Work was underway on America's first transcontinental railroad. Vanderbilt realized that its completion would transform the nation, slashing cross-country travel time by months.
Railroads were absolutely liberating because the railroads allowed cheap and efficient transportation from one corner of America to another.
Vanderbilt saw his future. He sold his ships and invested everything he had in railroads.
You talk about seeing around corners as an element of success. That's what differentiates the good leader. Not many people have it. Not many people can predict that corner. That is a characteristic of great leaders.
His decision to invest heavily in rail paid off. By the end of the war, Vanderbilt was the richest man in America, with a net worth of over $65 million, the equivalent of about $75 billion today. But despite all his money, he couldn't entirely escape the war's devastation. In the wake of the Civil War, America mourned publicly, while Vanderbilt grieved privately.
The first card is the past, the second, the present, and the third is the future. There has been an unexpected loss. Someone close to you.
My son, George. He died in the war. What about the future?
The Chariot. There will be a war.
War's over.
No. Your war is about to begin.
For Vanderbilt, this is a great tragedy. He had one son who had that same sense of physical strength and ability, and he had died when he was still quite young. It was deeply troubling for the Commodore.
For years, Vanderbilt had groomed George to take over the family business. Now, he was forced to rely on his less accomplished son, William.
I'm making you operations director of the Hudson Railroad.
Vanderbilt placed William in the midst of negotiations with the owners of a rival railroad.
So name your price.
If you give us your freight year-round, we will give you the privilege of allowing your passengers access into Manhattan for $200,000.
That privilege is not worth $200,000.
Then let us settle on $100,000. I believe that to be a fair and generous offer.
I'm not really interested in your generosity. I'm only interested in getting the best deal for my shareholders. And that does not include handing over $100,000 or even $1.
My father wants only what he believes is right.
The trouble is, your father doesn't know what is right. The old man should be put out to pasture.
The message was clear. The competition no longer saw Vanderbilt as a man to fear.
People are always rooting for very successful people to fail. The day people are not taking shots at you, it means you're not on top anymore.
But where they saw weakness, the Commodore saw an opportunity to assert his dominance. and teach William what it meant to be a Vanderbilt.
If they want a war, I'll give them a war.
Vanderbilt owned the only rail bridge into New York City. It was the gateway to the country's largest port, which supplied the entire continent. Vanderbilt knew this was the hammer he needed to beat his rivals into submission.
Sit down. I want you to close the Albany Bridge.
Without the bridge, every other railroad was shut out of New York City.
Vanderbilt, in essence, single-handedly erected a blockade around the nation's largest city, cutting it off from contact with the rest of the country. He was now asserting his dominance.
Ladies and gentlemen, this train will not be going any farther.
We're going to watch them bleed.
The Civil War had left America in ruins. For the first time in its short history, the nation had to rebuild. Aided by thousands of miles of newly laid rail track that was transforming the country. Despite his humble beginnings, Cornelius Vanderbilt had created a railroad empire that had made him the richest man in the country. But at 72, he was 30 years past the average life expectancy, and his competitors saw him as weak. This was a mistake they would come to regret. Locked in a battle for control of railroad lines east of the Mississippi, Vanderbilt was holding nothing back.
I want you to close the Albany Bridge. We're going to watch them bleed.
He controlled the only bridge into New York City, home to America's busiest port. Seizing an opportunity, he set up a blockade.
This train will not be going any farther.
Shutting the bridge left millions of tons of cargo unable to reach the rest of the country, and slowly bled his competitors dry. Before their stock was worthless, the owners of the rival railroad tried to sell all their shares. Word quickly reached Wall Street, triggering a massive sell-off.
Some money in there. Come on.
New York Central shares are dropping fast.
How low?
$20 a share.
Buy everything you can.
Too comfortable. Oh, here you go. Sold too much? Just for one.
Vanderbilt was buying all of that stock that suddenly flooded the market at rock-bottom prices.
3 aces.
Oh, that's good.
Within days, Vanderbilt took control of the rival railroad, creating the largest single rail company in America.
The New York Central Railroad became the centerpiece of his empire, and it came to him as the sudden result of a skillfully executed campaign to get revenge.
Railroads soon crisscrossed America, linking the country in a way that just 15 years earlier had been unimaginable, and providing over 180,000 jobs. Laying track became America's engine for unprecedented growth.
Railroads allowed the industrial economy to boom in ways that it couldn't have before.
One advance after the other, which essentially was led by the railroads, largely because there was a need to close the gap between those east of the Mississippi and those on the West Coast.
Vanderbilt had made himself the undisputed king of the railroads. And now, he wanted the world to know it. He envisaged a monument that would symbolize his power.
Work will begin on building a new station that will bring together the 3 railroads, the Harlem, the Hudson, and the Central. It shall be in the heart of New York and be called the Grand Central Depot.
Thousands of laborers worked for the next 2 years on the most ambitious urban construction project America had ever seen. Grand Central Depot was the biggest building in New York City and the biggest train station in the country, covering some 22 acres.
This enormous building towered over every other building in New York at the time. And it was a physical symbol of the size and power of Vanderbilt's railroad empire. Its importance as a physical symbol, as a physical capital of his empire, cannot be underestimated. And it still stamps New York's geography to this day.
Vanderbilt may have been on top of the world, but his blind ambition would soon make him vulnerable to a challenge coming from an unexpected quarter.
It's the Vanderbilt's money!
The growth of the railroads thrust America into the biggest building expansion the country had ever seen, led by a new breed of leader.
The story of America isn't just the story of the patriots that helped build the democracy. The reason the United States is the leading economy in the world is because of the work of entrepreneurs who created entire industries that propelled the United States to be the leader of the free world.
One man, Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, through brute force and intimidation, had made himself the undisputed king of the railroads. He now owned 40% of America's train lines. But he wanted them all.
To me, it's always what's next, and I think that's what drives most very successful people. It's never about the money. I mean, that's a way of keeping score. It's about achievement, and it's about winning a game, and it's about upping the ante.
Chicago was America's fastest growing city. The line connecting it to New York was one of the most traveled and valuable in the world. And it wasn't Vanderbilt's. To complete his empire, he needed to gain control of the Erie Line.
The Erie was one of the relatively early publicly traded corporations. Vanderbilt had the advantage of millions and millions of dollars. Deep pockets are always an advantage when you're trying to gain control of a corporation.
Vanderbilt instructed his agents to buy up as much stock as possible,
Buying Erie! Buying Erie!
demanding control of the company by the end of the week.
Erie at 45!
It was a vintage Vanderbilt move, one he'd pioneered, known today as a hostile takeover.
Erie 50!
But his attempt would be thwarted by an even more ingenious idea, cooked up by two relative unknowns, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk.
All right. The mistake that the Erie Board have made is that they have telegraphed where they need to expand without securing the land first.
Gould and Fisk were businessmen and directors of the Erie. They represented the new America that Vanderbilt was helping to create. One of self-made men with ruthless ambition. After years of watching the Commodore dominate, they were eager to build their own empire. They recognized Vanderbilt's plan to buy the line and saw an opportunity to defeat his takeover.
Competition, I think it's good for the system, and it's really, I think, what most businesses is about, is doing a better job on out-hustling your competitors.
Gould and Fisk began printing new shares of stock, using a printing press they'd set up in the basement of the Erie offices. Each share they printed diluted Vanderbilt's stake in the company, and they rolled off over 100,000.
There was some fine print in one of the clauses of the Erie's charter that allowed the board of directors to issue new stock, unbeknownst to shareholders.
Go.
And so the more shares that Vanderbilt bought, the more he had to buy in order to approach that magic majority.
Their plan was known as watering down stock. Highly illegal today, at the time, it had never been imagined. Its simplicity was brilliant. And Wall Street would never be the same again.
The only rule was there were no rules. Whatever it took to put your competition out of business, they were going to try to do it.
Unaware of what was happening, Vanderbilt continued to buy.
Think of the look on his face.
Oh, God, I wish I could be a fly on that wall.
The freshly printed shares were hand-delivered to Vanderbilt.
Here are the Erie shares. I assume we control the company now.
A toast! A toast!
To money.
To Vanderbilt's money!
Vanderbilt had bought $7 million worth of watered-down stock from Gould and Fisk, essentially throwing his money away. Vanderbilt had been underestimated before. But if you attack the king, you shouldn't expect to win. In the late 1860s, the greatest explosion of growth America had ever experienced was underway. Railroads now connected huge expanses of the country. Controlling them brought power that just 5 years earlier had been unimaginable. Many were staking their claim.
I think there are people in every generation that have a vision that transcends their moment in their time.
Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt owned more miles of rail than anyone in the world. But like all powerful men, he faced constant challenges.
Competition gets very aggressive. People have no idea how aggressive it is. And sometimes you don't even hear because what goes on behind your back is not a pretty picture.
At the height of his strength, Vanderbilt was outsmarted by a pair of upstarts.
It's to Vanderbilt's money.
Jay Gould and Jim Fisk fleeced the Commodore out of millions. And they wanted the world to know it.
Thank you. Don't mind if I do. It is no secret what Vanderbilt has been trying to do. He owns more railroads than anybody else. But Gould and me, we have struck a blow for the little guy.
It was a humiliating defeat for the Commodore, a man who was so fiercely competitive, who wanted to win at absolutely everything, to whom money was so important. And here he was, defeated and insulted publicly by Gould and Fisk.
Gould and Fisk may have been on top of the world, but they'd awakened a sleeping lion. Vanderbilt vowed never to be beaten again.
They don't think in terms of money. They think in terms of winning. Now, naturally, if you win big in business, money follows. But that shouldn't be your objective. Your objective should be to win. To win all the time. Not sometimes, every time.
Vanderbilt immediately began looking for a new edge. He realized that too many railroads had been built, and that the future of the industry wasn't in constructing new lines, but in transporting new cargo.
Innovation is not a big breakthrough invention every time. Innovation is a constant thing. But if you don't have an innovative company coming to work every day to find a better way, you don't have a company. You're getting ready to die on the vine.
If Vanderbilt could corner the market in a new source of freight, one that would keep his trains constantly full, he'd be able to control the railroad industry. And the Commodore knew just where to look. Oil was revolutionizing life in America. Crude from the ground was being refined into paraffin, known in the US as kerosene. It was a safe and inexpensive source of light that was completely changing the way people lived. Before kerosene, the average American didn't have access to an affordable light source. When the sun went down, darkness ruled. Kerosene was a phenomenon that would change the world, and Vanderbilt decided it was his next opportunity to cash in.
The idea is to see what's missing. That's what a creative entrepreneur does. He serves people with things that they need. Some people can't find a new thing to do. But sometimes you see something that everybody has to have. Say, oh man, I gotta give them this. And then you go to work on it because they need it.
Vanderbilt saw the demand for kerosene skyrocketing all over America. He knew that to meet the demand, its producers would need to transport their oil. If Vanderbilt could corner the market on transportation, he'd propel himself back to the top of the railroad industry. All he needed to do was find a supplier.
We're going to extend along the South Shore to Cleveland.
Why Cleveland?
Cleveland was a small city of just under 50,000 people, but it was positioned near an ocean of oil. Eastern Ohio was the Middle East of its day, and the area around Cleveland was the largest oil field in the world. Vanderbilt heard about a refinery near the railroads in Cleveland. It was the perfect target for his master plan. He contacted the owner, a struggling young oil man, whom Vanderbilt hoped would help make him money. His name was John D. Rockefeller.
Why are we paying so much on plumbers? We run a refinery. So we start making our own pipes. At this rate, we'll be lucky if we break even this year.
If you want to call it a day, John, just say. I should go.
Is everything all right?
It's fine.
At the age of 27, Rockefeller was in the early stages of building his refining business, and his company was teetering on the verge of bankruptcy. Vanderbilt saw him as someone he could manipulate to his advantage. An exclusive deal to ship Rockefeller's oil would ensure that the Commodore's train stayed full of cargo. Vanderbilt invited Rockefeller to come and meet him in New York. For the young oil man, the meeting was the opportunity of a lifetime. A route out of his troubles. And a way to save his company from complete collapse.
Rockefeller, he respected Vanderbilt. He could see what he had achieved. Vanderbilt was setting the pattern and the archetype of what Rockefeller himself wanted to be. He wanted to be the Vanderbilt of petroleum. That's the way he saw himself.
As Rockefeller prepared for his trip to New York, Vanderbilt's plan was set in motion.
Gonna take it.
The train departed Cleveland at 6:25 a.m. Fate intervened.
The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He restoreth my soul.
Rockefeller narrowly missed the train. It would have carried him to certain death. This close call had a profound impact on the young businessman.
He leadeth me into paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Amen.
Already a man of deep faith, he became convinced that God had spared him for a reason.
Without thinking that he himself in particular was chosen by God to become this great business success, Rockefeller believed that everything was divinely ordained. So nothing happened in the world without God's will, without God's blessing.
When Rockefeller eventually met Vanderbilt, he was a changed man. Whereas before, he was intimidated and facing bankruptcy. Now, he was a man of destiny. Cornelius Vanderbilt may have been the richest and most powerful man in America, accustomed to getting what he wanted. But he had no idea what he was about to encounter. A new force was on the rise.